Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, Julia is my co-partner, and we're looking at an article by Scott Jaschik that appeared in Inside Higher Ed on May 15th, entitled Admission Offices Cautiously Start Using AI. A question from a listener, once again, is Laura from Washington, and she wants to get a better understanding of how to know who's actually getting admitted in early decision one when you take out athletes and other protected classes. Our interview will continue, Lisa's interview with Dr. Lewis Newman, looking at his book about the importance of thinking critically and developing those critical thinking skills in college. And Lisa and I will start a whole new college spotlight about our visit to High Point University that we had on May 3rd. I'm here with Julia Eskimo. Hi, Julia.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
Good. I always look forward to your month when your week of the month when you're up. So I'm excited to chat with you about a new topic we haven't ever had on the podcast. But before we get into that, what tip is brimming around in your brain for the month?
It is time for school years to end, which I am excited about.
I've never seen your smile look so big.
It also means, though, that a lot of students are kind of left to their own independent work for the summer. They might not have a counselor or access to a counselor all the time. So my biggest tip for my students as they wrap up the school year and think about the time off they have in the summer is to really use that time wisely so that when you return in the fall for school, you have had a lot of your college application work done. Especially, I'm imagining most students who listen to this podcast are probably really motivated, really involved, really engaged, which means in your senior year, you probably have extracurricular commitments or leadership, or because you're a senior, you've got extra responsibilities. So I really tell my students to actually really think about the calendar of their summer. And if you can find a way to carve maybe 1 hour, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours a week to work on college apps, you could actually come back to school in the fall with so much work done. And I'm not asking you to, shut your door, stay inside and work forever all day long for the summer. But if you're able to kind of chip away at things, I recommend for my students to have 2 to 3 drafts of their Common App essay or their main essay. And then if you look at maybe your top 3 to 5 schools, and I don't mean just your dream schools, I mean schools that you realistically have a chance of getting into, and you just check out what the supplemental essays are for those schools. I do find that actually the bulk of the work for my students is writing the supplemental essays. So if you start to look at, hey, here's 5 schools I'm very sure I'm going to apply to, and let me just look at all of their supplemental essays, and you can start to figure out, oh, I see some patterns, I see some themes, I might be able to recycle here, I might be able to reword here. But if you actually know about the wall of work coming at you and you're able to draft maybe 5 supplemental essays, that puts you in a really good spot for starting fall of your senior year with a lot of work done, or at least a lot of groundwork covered.
So you go easy on your students because
I'd like to
Yeah,
go harder. Tell me what you do.
we say 80% of your applications done by Labor Day, and the last 20% by October 10th.
Oh my
You know,
gosh, come to my school and put that in place. I would love that.
just because you're so right with what you said about the fall. Like, not only is it the extracurriculars, it's especially for students aspiring to more selective schools, it's probably your most rigorous classes you're taking.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And then you also have the stress of college is stressful for people. Like, even just the psychology of like, am I going to be in LA, or am I going to be in Chicago? Am I going to be in Atlanta? Am I going to be in DC or in Ohio? Like, where am I going to be living? Like,
Yeah.
all that. And then there's just all, a lot of pressure people can feel, especially with peers sometimes. And that, so there's just an added element of stress with this whole process. So if you can get it done, and there's no reason why you can't, right? All the questions are out.
Yep.
We try to get the questions by July 5th from the schools so that you have really July and August. Of course, we try to do the personal statement before like late January to April, ideally. Get
Ooh,
it done. Get that done then.
love it.
Because sometimes kids are like, I'm at camp for 8 weeks. I'm at camp for 6 weeks. I'm doing this and that, and so it's just. And what they do is the students come back and they say, not that it's some big competition, but they'll say, man, it kind of feels really good to be so far ahead of the peers, because they'll hear
Yes.
that chatter. Like, what
Yes.
am I going to write my essay on? In their mind, they're thinking the one I did 4 months ago, or, people are like, I don't know, take the SAT or the ACT. That stuff is done.
Yes.
So that's a really, really big stress reducer, is to use this summer, rising senior year summer, bang out your applications, whether you go with the Julia Light plan or our plan. Just
Yes. Yeah.
get it done. And your point is really well taken. Like, this is not locking yourself up in your room and doing college stuff all the time.
Right.
Like, you could do a couple hours a week,
Mm-hmm.
For 10, 12 straight weeks and make massive progress.
Right.
Especially, we know the college-specific essays, I agree with you, they take the bulk of the time. They have to be custom.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a knack to them that once you learn a method and a style, they do get easier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. It's like a muscle that you work.
Yeah.
So by the time, October 15th rolls around, my students feel really confident. They know how to answer these questions. But if you start working that muscle a lot earlier, it'll just make life a lot better.
I also tell them, if you go by this plan, not only will you reduce the stress in the senior year, but you'll qualify for any admission priority or scholarship priority deadlines. And sometimes that's like a nice incentive. Parents like that too. I mean, why make it harder to get in or leave money on the table?
Right.
Because you missed dates. So good tip. I have a tip too. You get 2 tips today. I'm actually really excited about this tip. Some might think it's controversial. I kind of don't. So, Julia, when you read, I'm sure you probably agree with me, but correct me if you don't. A lot of the best personal statements that you read are written in first-person active voice with narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's difficult for people to write that way.
Right.
I know myself, I've had a challenging time teaching people how to write that way. I'm sure there's people out here that do it all the time that are probably better than me at that. But this is a place actually where you could take your original draft and you can go to Chat GPT and tell it, convert it to like first person active narrative. And it will do that without changing the essence of what you write. And you still might need to come behind it and still make sure that no changes were made that you're not comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
But I see a place to actually use ChatGPT to help people with learning how to write in first-person active narrative. What are your thoughts?
So to me, that would be the same as me at my school. Sometimes for my students who do feel like they're having a hard time finding their authentic voice or narrator, I have them go to their recent or most favorite English teacher who
Mm-hmm.
knows how they write and how to get it
Mm-hmm.
in line. So I guess it's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't rewrite it for them, but they help them kind of harness that. So that way, and the next thing you know, they walk away with a whole new sort of, it's the same content, but it's exactly presented the way that they were hoping for.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't following, is like for when you write in first person active narrative, it's like you're telling the story like you're in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a reader, it just draws you in and it builds that suspense. And it's just so much more interesting, as a reader before you have your conflict and then you move into your reflection piece,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple tips,
Yeah.
couple tips.
Hey.
So our admissions vernacular for today, I'm borrowing a term from Solingo that he had in his excellent book, Who Gets In and Why, where he refers to two types of applicants, drivers and passengers. And I really think he kind of nails it, right? So like drivers are people who start this process early, they're organized. Usually they're doing stuff by the end of 10th grade. Um, and they're thinking about their curriculum and their courses they're going to pick. They're getting on campuses. They're looking at deadlines. They're doing what we said. They're doing their writing ahead of time. They're organized. They're driving the process. They're setting themselves up so that any schools that have early deadlines, doesn't have to be early decision, could be early action. They've got great applications done and prepared, like all the things that are involved in that. Everything from they sought out their teacher recommendations in time. They did all the essays in time. They're aware of deadlines and whatever it is. If there's an interview, they're on point for all that. Where passengers are, they're passive. Like somebody else, they usually start the process in 12th grade. There are a lot of times they're unorganized or indifferent. They're not organized and they kind of go with the flow and they can miss out on a lot of opportunities because they either miss deadlines or they're not knowledgeable. And it could be anything from missing test prep deadlines or not being aware of anything, FAFSA deadlines, all of those things.
Mm.
And there's really are two different types of people in the process. Now, a lot of times, honestly, is social class is highly correlated with this. Parents that your family has a real big deal to do with who's a driver and who's a passenger. It's not just sort of this one person's got like this innate talent and this other person doesn't. A lot of times these things are highly related to family and social class and parenting and whether you're first gen and, versus not first gen. But it's early bird gets the worm. And
Mm.
your thoughts on the driver passenger name for two different types of applicants. And I know you don't see a lot of passengers at the school that you're at, but you've worked with people in different contexts and your experience goes outside of just Milton.
Oh, totally. I would say I have some students who begrudgingly are in the process, so I'd call them passengers. But it is, every now and then I have not every now and then, pretty commonly actually, I have a student where if we had just started maybe even 6 months earlier, if they had gotten a little more serious 6 months earlier, we might have much more polished essays. We might have, the interview piece is a big one. A lot of the time, my students, by the time they feel like they have the organizational bandwidth to start thinking about other application components, they've missed the deadlines for the regular decision interview process. And some of my students, even if the interview maybe doesn't carry a lot of weight, it just feels like they really wish they had that opportunity to kind of present themselves. So certainly I find that not for all drivers, but I will say, I always tell my students as a little carrot incentive, dangling it in front of their faces, is that, at my school, we have a winter break that's substantive or substantive. Thank you. And we are gone for a while and we are closed. And so we tell students, if you would like your college counselor to read your regular decision applications, even if you think you're going to get into your early school, you need to turn them in by December 1st so we can turn them back to you. And I always tell my students that of the students that actually give me their essays before December 1st for their regular applications, almost 100% of those students do get into their early school. So there must be something correlated with their success and their organization. So I do think there's something to being a driver in the process for sure.
Yeah, you bring a good point up. Like, while this is highly correlated to who's first gen, who's not, social class, it's not 100% correlation. Like, there are parents, they might be double doctors. I have names of people in mind who will go unmentioned. And the parents are totally driving the process.
Yes.
And they're frustrated that their student seems disinterested and apathetic.
Right.
So there's still passengers that come from highly well-resourced families.
Definitely.
And sometimes it's boys maturing later than girls. It could be a little bit of that. We all see that when those of us who work with high school students, we definitely see sometimes boys, it kicks in 10th or sometimes not even till 11th, but sometimes it just kicks in later.
Yep.
Sometimes students resent the pressure they feel.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's their way of showing resistance to the pressure.
Yes.
You want to comment on that, Julia? Because I can see you can relate to that.
I do. I see that a lot. Or even especially, my high school is an independent school that's really rigorous. And sometimes kids already feel like they're so much under pressure that the college process just adds a whole nother layer, and they'll either freeze in that sort of discomfort or they'll run away. So I've had students who are like, I'm going to take a gap year during high school. I'm like, well, when you come back, we still have to resume this college process. But it is, and this is where even, I think all parents have great intentions and all comes from a good place, but also having to work with people whose frontal lobes aren't yet formed. And we have to find a comfortable sort of driving spot for them. Where they're able to have their own agency in the process, but also not be completely paralyzed by the process or run away.
Yeah, Lisa brought up something, really interesting to me that I was not aware of in a really recent episode when she was answering a question a listener named Lee had sent in about learning differences. And a lot of times students, like this is documented, a lot of times students with certain learning differences are 3 to 5 years behind and delayed in their development. And so, she used the example of, you can't expect if someone is like a 4-year-old to do what a 7 or 9-year-old would do. They're 3 to 5 years behind in their delay. So there's a lot of reasons why you can see passengers and drivers besides just disinterest and demotivation when you really roll back the curtain.
Right.
Yep. Good stuff. All right. Our big number is 1.8 billion. And that is how many monthly visitors ChatGPT is getting right now.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
100 million users and 1.8 billion visitors. That's crazy. And that was actually just February to April 2023. So it could even be higher now. Yeah. So I'm glad I have Microsoft stock.
You always have the right calls early, Mark.
Not always, but I try.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right. Well, we are transitioning to an article that's on that AI topic, which was, you see, I was throwing out AI things there
see what you did.
Yeah, you see what I did there with the 1.8 billion and using ChatGPT to do first person active narrative. So before I lead into this article, I have to tell a brief story. So one of our most dedicated listeners, never misses an episode, one of the people I say in our listening family from California, she sent in something about a year ago wanting to know how colleges are using AI in admissions decisions. And I was like, they're really not. And it turns out like he was just probably 6 months early because a lot is starting to change.
Yes.
Yeah, she's like involved in AI in her work. And so she sort of says, so almost saw it as inevitable that it would be used in some capacity. So here's an recent article by Scott Jaschik, one of our favorites, inside higher ed. And it's called Admission Offices Cautiously Start Using AI. Says they're divided about what to do for ChatGPT, but that doesn't prevent them from embracing AI. And it says some admission offices are starting to use AI to review transcripts, which are a key part of the application. And it goes on to say that rather than have human checking of the work, they're using machines, and they insist no one is being admitted entirely through AI. One of the examples it uses is Maryville University, a private college in Missouri with 6,500 students, but they all enroll online, 6,500 online students. And they're using AI for transcript reviews for these 6,500 students. And they quote Phil Cormany, the chief innovation officer at the university, and he talked about how he recently contracted with a company called, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing this right, SIA, S-I-A, and it's a tool from a company called One Origin to review transcript reviews in September. And then Cormany stressed that the use of SIA isn't just about automatic reading of transcript. He says when the AI reviews the transcript, it enables the admission officers to spend more time on other things. Goes on to say it's about a change of philosophy from control to community. We are all collectively obsessed by data. Then they actually interviewed, man, there's some challenging names for me over here today, dear Julia. I'm trying. Ban Chan Siam, VP for Sales and Marketing at One Origin. He said his company has 22 higher ed customers that are using SIA right now, and they're paying $500 to $3,000 a month, depends on how many transcripts are being reviewed. And Siam says, we've eliminated the manual processes, which are error-prone. Says the college transcripts that are being reviewed right now are for transfer admissions. Says instead of going through all the applications, an admission officer can get the information instantly. He stressed his company is trying to help admission officers spend more time actually making decisions. Then it goes on to talk about Stephen Harmon, who's the executive director for the Center for 21st Century Universities at Georgia Tech, who says Georgia Tech is not yet using AI in admissions, but we are experimenting with it. And they're experimenting with it with their large online Masters of Science program as a test case. And so far, what they're doing at Tech is they're comparing how decisions being made by AI compare to when admission advisors make decisions. And they're finding so far a 93% match. And it says, what is the appeal? Well, the volume of applicants continues to increase at Tech, so anything we can do to improve their workflow is helpful. Then he says, I don't see us relying on AI for admissions, maybe ever, but it could become a useful tool in the process. And then there's a section in the article that says, well, what are the experts saying? And so they refer to blog post at North Shore Consulting. It says many institutions receive tens of thousands of applications each year, making it a Herculean task for human evaluators to sort through and assess each one. This is where AI comes into play. Software can quickly and accurately analyze large swaths of data, enabling universities to streamline their admission process and spend more time focusing on the finer aspects of student admissions. Goes on to say, others say it may be way too early to declare any kind of consensus. They interviewed David Hawkins, who's the Chief Education and Policy Officer at NACAC, via email. And Hawkins says, right now, there isn't anything approaching consensus about where AI should or shouldn't be used. There's a common thread running through many conversations that will form the basis for future practices. And Hawkins goes on to say that it is unlikely at this point that institutions would entrust high-stakes decisions to AI processes, or such a move would be considered a best practice in the future, but there's a great deal to be discovered about the potential and limits of the new technology. And then the last quote I want to read comes from Melanie Gottlieb, who's executive director of the American Association of Collegiate Registrars. She says a few things. She said, I've not yet heard of using AI to make admissions decisions. But then Gottlieb added, for competitive institutions, I think there may be concerns in the application of AI to a process that the public already finds opaque and challenging. I might also have concerns regarding inadvertently hard coding of bias into the AI models.
Mhm.
These conversations are certainly coming, but we aren't having them quite yet. So, Julia, you've read the article. As Dave likes to say, what say you?
Yes, I really liked the way this was structured because I think even myself, I have these moments where I'm like, robots, like I'm just not ready for this.
I know.
But I think what Melanie Gottlieb said is so important, and also David Hawking said in this, is that bias is inherent in AI. It is built by humans. And so that is where I get a little nervous. But I do feel that I do think as a society as a whole, we have to think about how many steps ahead technology is from our ethics. But I do think that colleges are operating in good faith and cautiously in all the right ways. And that I don't think, and maybe there will be a time, but I don't think anytime soon we will see, especially selective college admissions processes replaced wholly by AI. Selfishly, I like the idea of sort of the standardization of processing transcripts. And as someone who so my school does not actually offer grades on a transcript for the 9th grade year. We believe that a student should just get used to my school first and foremost. And that has been fine, except at schools that do use human processors for transcript sort of review. And I could have 3 students all from the same year reviewed differently depending on which human picked their transcript from the pile to be processed. And this is even at my flagship public school. So UMass Amherst will have one person process this, like a very similar transcript in a really different way. And most of the time I can catch it, but I really wonder about what my colleagues at public schools or high school counselors where the average caseload is 250 students, how are they able to catch every time? Alabama, Wisconsin, UMass, Colorado, any of these places who might not use an SIR misprocesses my transcript and actually will make a decision on a student that's incorrect because they didn't process the transcript correctly. They thought something was missing. It wasn't complete. So I guess I'm a little selfishly excited about that if there is a human checkpoint on the other end. But I have a hard time sort of seeing this take over all processes. And I'm glad that the many voices in this article definitely address the idea of bias in the process.
Yeah, your thoughts are mine exactly. Like, if there's a way you could take transcripts in a systematic way and extract information from them, maybe if schools have a rank, you pull it out, or even if you're I could even see sort of formulas being used to recalculate GPAs, maybe that could be trusted. You know, obviously they would really need to be tested. But when you get into the finer aspects of holistic admissions, I just don't see how you can do it.
Right.
Because there's just so many components that are being factored in. And I know that a lot of times the public doesn't understand that, but you know, you're looking at like the background of the family and is English spoken in the home and all of these kinds of things and grade trends and how would you factor in, for example, someone had a dip in their 10th grade grades because their parents went through a divorce or their grandmother passed away who they were very close to. And those are the kinds of things that humans can take into consideration. One of those last lines I read, I'm going to read it again because it really resonated with me. Yeah, Melanie Gottlieb, Executive Director of American Association of Collegiate Registrars. She says, for competitive institutions, I think there may be concerns in the application of AI to a process that the public already finds opaque and challenging. I have concerns regarding inadvertently hard coding of bias. These conversations are coming. So I think that, boy, I think not only do I think it would be difficult for an institution to capture all the fine aspects of holistic admissions when you're just trying to be fair, that a human can factor. I don't think the public would buy it. There's already, like she's right, like process is already seen as opaque and people are already cynical.
Yes.
I think it'd be very hard for the public to trust that AI made a correct decision.
Right.
We're not there. We're not even close to being there yet. I don't know if we'll ever get there.
No, I know. And we actually had, there was a flavor of this. My school, maybe about 10 years ago, was really at the forefront of the mastery transcript movement. So this is the idea of this is like, we love talking about well-resourced, easy things for us to do at independent schools. But
I've been wanting to talk about mastery. Brennan leads the mastery school now that he left his job in New Hampshire and he's out working at Saul Khan's school. They use mastery. So when I was in December with him, he talked at length with me about it, but we haven't really talked to our listeners about it. Why don't you explain to our listeners what mastery is?
So the concept, I love the concept in theory, don't get me wrong. But as a college counselor, it really gets me nervous. But the concept being is to sort of, as a transcript, instead of having grades or some sort of standardized unit measurement or one final metric that says how you're doing, is to provide sort of comments, a narrative as to what the student's strengths are, where the student's growth points are. So instead of, an A in English, you get sort of a paragraph of narrative about, how the student contributed and where they were. I love that in general because I love the idea of removing stress from trying to achieve a grade and focusing on how to be your best student self and all those things. But interestingly, when I was an admission officer, there was a couple schools that we often got applications from where they don't issue grades. And instead I would be reading the teacher comments. And while the school I worked for didn't do this, I heard of other schools that basically used a computer, like a find search sort of mechanism, to find certain buzzwords and assign weight to them, and then assign a letter grade to those comments. And I would imagine that if that is how we would go and how we might use AI, then everyone will just use the same words to describe everyone else. And then we're back in the same spot, right? And I do worry about what you were saying just a little while ago, Mark, that is a certain kind of culture that says what weight goes to where or how it's expressed. And so you might have students where it's not in a traditional narrative or traditional words are being used to show their fit or their strengths or their talents. And that gets missed by a computer who's not been programmed to kind of catch those things. I do kind of worry about that. So this all reminds me of sort of that mastery conversation where I think it's super student-centered, but as a selfish college counselor, I was so nervous that we would have to send out a narrative transcript rather than a grade transcript to colleges. And then they'd be like, I don't have time for this. I'm going to synthesize and process the information and not the way it was intended and come up with my own rating out of your own words.
I agree with 100% of everything you said. Like when I hear the reasons for the mastery transcript articulated, they're very impressive. It has to do a lot with students are motivated for learning for the sake of learning, not for learning to get a grade. And when you change that paradigm, you can just light a fire under them. I know at Westtown for a while, we considered looking at mastery, and I know that Susan had some interest in it. But I'm not somebody who gets migraines. The only time I get a migraine, it feels like a migraine. I can't drink cold stuff, and I keep going back and getting smoothies and stuff. Then I get this incredible head rush, and sometimes I like almost crash the car because my eyes have to close. So that's the closest thing. And I know that is not a good feeling,
Right.
but I almost felt a migraine coming on, Julia, when you were describing that, because same for me. When I was in admissions, I can think of two schools, St. Anne's and Brooklands.
Yep.
They would send those narratives to us.
Yes.
And was that one of the schools that you were talking about?
Yeah, sure was.
St. Anne's would send those things, and they were big and thick. There was so much reading, and I hated them. And then Carolina Friends is another school.
Right.
Did you get applications from them? Carolina Friends, they would do the same thing.
Yeah.
And I hated it because it just wasn't really practical given the other demands that you have.
Right.
Now, one of the things Brennan Barnard, he's actually worked at having them change it after getting feedback from the admission officers about how it's not practical. So he's sort of come up with a model there that still involves the basic core, but doing it in a way that's more user-friendly to admission offices. So that's fascinating. I just know that I almost felt one of my head rush migraines coming on when you went there, because I could just picture those big, fat, thick bunches of pages I was expected to read and rate, and it was just going to take too much of my time.
Yes. We still love you, Louis Trujillo, though. Don't worry.
But I think that, it's just, I know we're making a lot of modern developments and advancements, and it's kind of scary, like this AI, because I was hearing people say, like, in 2023, like in this election, you can expect them to have all kinds of things coming out of people's mouths that weren't from them, and it's going to look like it's completely coming from them.
Right.
And like that's what's going to happen in 2023. So it's kind of scary, this world we're going into. And I know that's a negative example, but I know there'll also be positive examples of ways things are going to improve. But just consider me cynical that AI will ever be able to take into consideration all of the nuances that a human can do.
Right.
To look at every single thing in its context. Even something like, somebody has all these titles with their extracurriculars. I remember something a few years ago where this student had, and this was not a student I worked with, but it was someone who told me the story who was incredibly credible, who I knew. And this student had started what looked like a really impressive nonprofit charity overseas to help the poor. And a couple admission officers were really impressed in the office. And one of them was cynical and made some phone calls and basically found out that the father had just put like $50,000 down to like create a charity for the kid.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of stuff happens. And it happens a lot in certain circles.
Yep. Sure does.
And I could just so see AI getting, duped by that kind of thing. Right.
Or even misinterpreting, we all have, probably happens at my school maybe more than in the general public, but a really lovely applicant, a perfect applicant, if it makes sense. They've got all these leadership qualities. They have all the grades. They have the right curriculum, and they're really great. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're kind of missing that, for no fault of their own, sort of that compelling aspect. And all of a sudden, students are like, how did they not get into these most selective schools? And it's because a human could see the difference between a student that had like significant passion and curiosity next to sort of the student that, definitely checked all the right boxes, but maybe isn't showing up in the same sort of textured and compelling ways that a human can determine. And I would worry that a computer might assign weight or meaning to things that aren't in line institutionally with the college, or even sort of how do you make those really small distinctions between people who look the same on paper but present really differently in real life?
Yeah, I just don't know how a computer can take into context all of just the nuances around being well-resourced and under-resourced. Just those two things alone, and how that factors into opportunities.
Right. And so contextual too, right? You can have you could have a super well-resourced student who's an immigrant, and then you could have a super under-resourced majority student from a rural area, or maybe a lot of life got in the way of their transcript, and that's not captured easily in the application.
Yeah. So what should our takeaways be for our listeners on this topic?
Besides the fact that you and I are geriatric millennials, or that's how I call myself. And we don't, I love that we keep calling them computers too this whole time. I think if anything, I'm really encouraged by this article in the sense that I think everyone I've talked to is cautiously approaching the issue of AI and admissions, and that I don't see anyone willy-nilly embracing it. I do see that you could fully embrace it if you are an access institution, like Melanie Gottlieb mentioned. Like if you're a community college or a really open, non-selective 4-year college that says you just need to meet our requirements. We don't ask for teacher recs. We don't ask for a resume or activities list or essays. We just need to see what classes you've taken and what your grades are. That I can totally understand. And I would love for the money then to go to, instead of people processing transcripts, support resources or other things on campus. I love that. But I do feel confident that we won't dive in without thinking about everything in selective college admissions with overusing AI.
I'm really glad you brought that point up, because one thing I was thinking when I was reading is, I often look at admissions from the 2 paradigm model, holistic versus admissions by the numbers. And some people call it quantitative. Some people call it guaranteed admissions. There's different terms for it. I just prefer to call it admissions by the numbers. And it used to be test scores GPA. In some cases, it was a freshman index, or some type of scale like that. In some cases, it was like a mandatory minimum model. You hit a certain GPA, a certain test score. And now with so many schools being test optional, it's mostly just GPA. I see how it could be used in that model. And I really do, because you could use it to run calculations and run models. Because in that system, you're not taking all the nuance into consideration. There's no recs, there's no extracurriculars. There's not usually even grade trends aren't even factored in, or the school you're coming from. Nothing about your personal story or your essays, extracurricular, like none of that is even factored in that model. And so in that model, it's basically running calculations. Right. And so that's something that I think it could be trusted for, and a lot of schools hire personal people to be pre-readers.
Right.
There could potentially be a place where it could do some of that pre-reading.
Yes.
It's where people are looking for certain things on a transcript. They could be scanned and found. So I do see a place for it, but it's mostly more in just either admissions by the numbers or transcript interpretation. But I would say for our listeners, just to kind of stay in tune with what's happening in this space.
Right.
Because my gut tells me 2 years from now, maybe 1 year from now, if we came back and revisited this, we were probably going to see some more experimentation with some different things beyond even what we're seeing here. What I don't see is the Davidsons, the Haverfords, the Dukes, the Pomonas, the USCs and the UChicagos. I don't see the schools that do holistic admissions and that really take great pains and great effort to get to know each individual applicant and try to be fair. I just don't see that. I would be surprised if even in my lifetime if we ever see that.
Right.
Maybe I'm naive. Who knows? Maybe robots will be running all the world.
Maybe 2 years from now when we do this podcast, you and I will be robots.
Well, I want to say something. I had a conversation, with Rod Skinner like a couple years ago, and he's been kind of following this AI stuff. Like this was way before it broke out.
Yeah.
And he has expressed concerns that the human counselor will be replaced by AI. And I disagreed with him, but, I always think there's going to be a need for that human touch. But he's like, if you read the cutting edge stuff, this, that, the other. I do think more and more and more people are going to feel like, oh, I just got my college list off some AI thing. And I think it can lead to a false sense of confidence that their college list is better than they think it is. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, interesting enough. So, I actually, I also advise students, and I happen to have my advisees as my college counselees this year. And one of my students is just like a whiz with computer science. And so for fun, he has a very clear idea what he wants to study. So honestly, putting his list together made it pretty easy for me. So for fun, in front of me, he had ChatGPT generate a college list using the same parameters I did, and they were nearly identical.
Interesting.
But now we weren't talking about quality of life measures. Like, he is just all about what is my best computer science program out there. He didn't care about where he was in the country. He didn't care about the size of the school. But we put in a few other small little parameters. And so that made sense. But I asked him, I kind of want to do that with like a college list for one of my students who's like, it's all about the fit and the feel and the community.
Yeah,
like,
to me, those are two different things, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, you can scan lists for top programs in computer science.
Right.
That doesn't surprise me at all. What it's not going to reveal is what about the person that, wants a certain location, certain campus, certain feel, certain programs,
mission and values,
values, culture. That's just where it can't get at. And my concern is that like a little knowledge is dangerous.
Yes.
And that some people will feel like I've got a great list now, and it may not be balanced.
I would love that. Yes. We didn't do the analysis piece of that, but I think we should do that next. I'd love to see what it thinks.
Yeah. But, I will credit Rod, because I think that he was like, he saw this AI wave coming probably before I did. And I think he was onto something with like where things are going and how fast they're moving there. And I'm going to say this conversation, Julia, this was probably, it's 2023 now. This was probably 2019.
Yeah. It was a while
that we
ago.
had this conversation. And he's like, I don't know if we're going to have jobs with where AI is going to be. But one thing I've learned, people really value human contact and human touch.
Yeah.
I learned that the hard way. I developed this college admissions video series in a box, and I thought, oh, this is great. 10 hours in a box. It shows you everything. It was like $279. And people are like, no, I want to talk to you.
Right.
Like,
Yep.
I'm like, oh, thought I was saving you money. No.
Yep.
I want the human contact. I want to be able to get my question, so I just learned that lesson. There is like value to people in personal customization, and we're social beings too.
Yes.
On top of it, and people want that customization.
Right.
So some of my fear is people are going to get some false knowledge of, I think I have a great college list. I don't need to listen to anybody. Like I got it from a computer.
Yes.
On the other hand, if I think of a completely under-resourced person that doesn't have access to any counselors at all, it's probably better than what they're doing now.
Fair.
But those are just my thoughts on that. I know we kind of went off there on a tangent, but I think that's coming, right? The AI-generated college list.
Totally. It's all these sort of like philosophical, social, emotional conundrums that are coming up,
It just feels like, where's this world going to be in 5 or 10 years?
I know.
If we were like living on Mars and we came down, we might not even recognize it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, great talking to you as always, Julia. Appreciate you, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
So we have a second question from Laura from DC.
My second question is, when I look at the numbers and the percentages accepted for ED1, there appears to be a step change so that it's higher in ED1 than regular decision. But I know that in ED1 applicant pool, there are athletes and other recruited applicants. So how can I get a better understanding of the applicant pool for ED1 to know that how many are truly just like regular people who don't have someone pulling them into that class. Thank you for everything that you guys do. I find that your podcasts are really helpful. I recommended them to friends, and my husband is listening to them as well.
Yeah, and Laura, first of all, thank you for recommending us to so many people and getting your husband to listen. That's a big accomplishment.
Wow.
Because we know women are the drivers usually of education. So consider me impressed. So let me say something about this. I would say that it's not that important that you figure out exactly how many people in early decision are athletes or not. You can if you want. And for that, you can just go to the search bar on yourclassmykid.com, put in Hillary.
Yeah,
Hillary talked about, where she talked about literally counting the students that are athletes on, and figuring out how many spots are available for your student. Now, Hillary did a few interviews with us. So one is interview 128, which looks at early decision 1 versus early decision 2. You might be interested in that. And then interview 129, a creative way to find out how many spots are available for my student who's a non-athlete. So let me just do the shameless plug Lisa did.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, when we have 500 hours of content, sometimes some of that past content comes in handy. So
Yes, it does.
Let me first say that, and that'll show you a way if you want to know how many athletes are there. But I would say overall, Laura, it's not actually that important for you to figure out exactly how many athletes are there. It is important philosophically to understand why ED1 oftentimes has a higher admit rate than ED2. And there are a few reasons. One is, in general, the ED1 pool is stronger than ED2. ED2, I said. I meant ED2.
Yeah, ED poo.
Whatever.
Don't like it.
Whatever. Oh, my goodness. So overall, sometimes people are unrealistic. And they take a shot at an ED1 school they probably shouldn't have, and then they still don't really learn their lesson. And then they take a shot at an ED2 school. They don't really adjust and aim for something less selective. So that's part of it. But there's another important component. In ED1, a college needs everybody. They need all types of kids. Whatever you're bringing to the table, they need that. And so, in fact, one of the reasons why ED is so valuable is because you're trying to secure a balanced class and please multiple stakeholders. So ED1 is kind of helps you do that, right? You can look at all the different types of kids you're trying to get and hopefully ensure you have a balanced class. And so what happens now this is more true for schools that admit like a significant amount of kids from ED, especially some of the independent private schools that get up to 50% or more of their class, more so than the schools that take like under 20%. Then this one I'm going to say won't apply as much. But there are a lot of schools, especially if you look at more selective, that do take 50 and 60% of their class ED. And so for a lot of times, for those schools in ED2, they can look and say, you know what? We didn't really get anybody from Iowa. We're really off on our gender balance. It could be all kinds of things. It could be for schools that are looking at major. It could be off in certain programs. Could be racial, could be ethnic, could be first gen, could be full pay, high pay. I mean, there's just so many different things. And so in ED2, you start to look at who did you not get in ED1 that you're going to want to bring in. And that's one of the reasons why the ED2 admit rate is not as high as the ED, or the ED2 admit rate is different than ED1. And really, literally, the more I think about it, we did a whole entire interview on that with Hillary. Like we went into she even went into explaining why schools are reluctant to share that data and how it's hard for the public to understand. So I really would encourage you to go back and listen to that for more details on that. Anything else you want to say on this one, Lisa?
No, I think that Hillary did such a great job that anything I would say would probably cheapen it. So listen to Hillary.
I mean, I do think it's a fair point. I do want to acknowledge this, that one of the reasons why the admit rate is higher in ED, that is the place where schools take their athletes. And this is definitely going to be noticeable for schools like Bates and Bowdoin and schools like that literally take 40% of their students are athletes, and they're small schools to begin with. Is very, very common when somebody goes through the pre-read process for athletic recruiting. And I usually take 7 to 9 kids through that a year. That it's very, very common, most of them being D3, that the results for the feedback will be you have a spot if you ED. Like that's very, very common. Not always, because the more talent you have, the more they'll work with you. That's true of anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they will make an exception if it's like you're going to be there. Like one of the students I worked with last year, he's like, I'm not EDing. Not doing it. It was a swimmer. And there are a lot of schools that he looked at, Lisa, where his times are already faster than the fastest person on their roster.
Wow.
So he had a lot of schools, like really selective schools, that were going to take him without an ED. So you do have more clout when you're like that when you're the LeBron. But for the average person, it's usually you have a spot contingent on an ED. So that is part of what skews that ED admit rate. But that's just something I think someone can be interested in out of curiosity. How much it actually impacts the average admit an applicant. I kind of see that as something that's sort of outside of your control. And I love the curiosity of just wanting to know more. But for the most part, just know that there is a higher admit rate for ED. That doesn't mean you should automatically do it. Still needs to be a school that makes financial sense and that you've gotten to know really well, enough so that you're willing to make that commitment level to it. I think that's enough, especially given the fact that we did an interview really recently that addresses this, I think, in a lot of detail. Right.
Absolutely.
All right. Hopefully that helps.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, hopefully you heard the first part of Lisa's interview with Dr. Newman on critical thinking. It's one of the more important interviews we've had on our podcast. So if you missed part one, strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that. But in part two, Dr. Newman talks about 4 essential critical thinking skills for college. He also shares some excellent examples of how we can apply critical thinking to our everyday life. And he talks about the danger of confirmation bias and how that can hinder us from accepting the truth. Listen and enjoy.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I've often thought, people are subject matter experts and then they're, put in this position where they're supposed to teach. And teaching is much better than I do. Like it's a skill, it's an art form. There are a lot of different factors to it. And I don't think that probably a lot of these new faculty are given training in their graduate programs with that. I know I was a graduate assistant and they just kind of gave me, a class and said, go. I always felt like a little bit of an imposter because I'm doing my best here, but I don't know if I'm doing it right.
A lot of graduate students are put in that position. I will say this: these days, it's more and more common, I think, for institutions to have. Sometimes that learning and teaching center is really more focused on the graduate students who are
right.
who are teaching assistants for big courses than they are even on the full-time or regular faculty. But even then, I think it's a real benefit if that exists at an institution, and we're not just sort of throwing people in the deep end and saying swim and figure out how to teach.
Yeah, no, those are really amazing tips, and I don't think that's something people are going to hear from other places. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Sure,
I'm definitely going to encourage my students to start doing this now. So in the book, one of the big pieces of your book is developing and using your critical thinking skills. So can you tell us more, like what are critical thinking skills? And then I think you have like certain questions that you organize them around. Tell us more about that.
Sure. I do. There's a whole field out there of people who study and teach critical thinking. And I don't presume to be an expert. My background is in religious studies. I have a lot of experience teaching. And a lot of experience in administration, but I didn't ever study critical thinking formally. So what I began to do, based on that early story that I told a bit ago about my contact with this particular student, as I began to think more about what is it that students really need to know how to do to succeed in college from an academic kind of intellectual standpoint, I began to sort of sort through my own experience. What is it that I expected students to know how to do? What did my assignments expect them to do? And I began to talk to colleagues in other fields and began to formulate what I thought of as the essential critical thinking skills for college. Right? So I'm not going to claim that this is everything that critical thinking encompasses everywhere that we use our critical thinking skills. But I will say that I think, having now tested this with a number of different people, I think it's a pretty good summary of what we expect in college. And I boiled it down to basically four very, very broad, but four general kinds of things that we want college students to know how to do. Number one, explore context. So, let me lay them all out, and then I'll come back and
Okay.
elaborate a bit.
Absolutely.
Number one is explore context. Number two is consider alternatives. Number three is weigh evidence. And number four is examine implications and new applications. I put those things together. So circling back, exploring context can mean a lot of things. You read something that's given to you. There's a lot of context. There's a historical context. This thing didn't just drop out of the sky. It was written at some particular time, at some particular place, by some particular person or people who lived some kind of life and whose life and circumstances may have influenced who they are, how they thought, how they approached their subject, why they even became interested in that subject. There are a whole range of ways in which context will help you understand and place the thing that you're looking at. So it gives you a perspective. You're not just reading this thing as if it's a voice coming out of the void at you, and you're just supposed to sort of read it disconnected from anything. You read it in connection with the context that you discover it came out of. And so you need to explore context in order to understand things. Second, considering alternatives. Like, think about interpreting a story or a poem, right? Or interpreting lab results if you're running an experiment. There's almost always more than one interpretation, more than one way of reading those results. And instead of just taking the first way that appears to you or that occurs to you, you want to always be looking for alternatives and weighing the merits of this way of reading it or interpreting it versus some alternative way. I like to call this, with apologies to Robert Frost, the road not taken, right? A famous poem that I hope your listeners know. If not, go check out your Robert Frost poems. But the road not taken is always the question of, so this was one way of looking at it or one way of interpreting it. What are the other possibilities that may not be right in front of me? But if I considered them, I would realize, well, this one looked good, but maybe there's another one that's really better.
Right.
Or maybe I'll at least see the merits and shortcomings of the one I'm looking at more clearly if I see it in relationship to alternatives. So thinking about alternatives and considering them is also an important piece of critical thinking. Number three, weighing evidence. This is maybe in some ways the most important piece of critical thinking. Right? We don't take things at face value in academia. Right? If somebody makes a claim that something is true or something is likely, you want to know, well, why? What supports that? Right? I will add as a maybe bit of editorializing here. We see this all around us all the time. We see reports about everything from vaccine effectiveness to election fraud or integrity, or politicians and other people make statements. Advertisers make statements all the time about the effectiveness of their products. Like, do you just take that at face value, or do you stop and ask yourself, well, how do they know? Like, what have they tested it? Who tested it? Did the people who tested have a vested interest in convincing me because they stand to gain if we buy the product? The example I use in the book is, a study that was produced that suggested that sugar is not really very bad for your health. Well, it turns out that the sugar industry had a role in financing that particular piece of research. Well, that should give you some pause when you listen to, right? So you want to ask yourself always, what's the evidence, and where is it coming from, and how reliable is it? How objective is it? How extensive is it? Right? All of those questions are kinds of critical thinking questions that we always want to be asking. And last but not least, what are the implications, right? If this is true, that whatever it is that I'm reading or whatever it is that I'm looking at, what else follows? Where does that lead? What other conclusions might I draw? Or similarly, if you get, and this happens a lot in college, you learn something, and then on the test, you don't get asked to reproduce exactly what you learned in the textbook or the lectures. You're asked to take something that you learned and apply it in some new context or in relationship to some new set of data or some new set of circumstances to prove that you really understood the theory or the idea that you were taught. And it's the ability to apply and see implications that is another piece of critical thinking. And so my book is basically built around those four: context, comparison, evidence, and implications. And I claim, and I think I'm basically on pretty solid ground here, that pretty much every college assignment you will ever see is going to ask you to do one, and frequently more than one, of those things. And so one of the whole chapters of the book includes examples of college assignments parsed with an eye to what are the critical thinking skills that you need in order to tackle this assignment effectively. And my goal is to help students learn what those are, and then learn how they're going to show up in their assignments and what they need to do to do them in the ways that their faculty are likely to expect them to do them. So that's, in a nutshell, those are the kinds of critical thinking skills that I discuss in the book.
Yeah, when I read this, I was like, yes, this is exactly what we should be doing anytime we get some sort of problem that we need to solve, or we, get some new information or a new source. If you can teach students to systematically go through these 4 questions, I think that's going to just be a game changer for them. And like I said, I think a lot of times people who turn out to be good students kind of maybe do this, just they figure it out on their own, or it's just innate. But, this is something that everyone can learn and that everyone can apply. And I have to agree with you. I feel like if everyone did learn this and apply this, we might not have some of the issues that we're having now, because, when you talk to people who have such disparate news sources, in my clinical practice, I talk to all kinds of people. And one client will always bring, well, Lisa, did you hear about, X, Y? I'm like, no, of course not. Because you and I are on different, we are literally on, we have different versions of reality. And sometimes I'll even point out, well, that's not true, and here's why. But it's like, no, well, Tucker Carlson told me this, so it must be true, that kind of thing. And I'm just like, there's not that critical thinking going on there.
Right.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Linda with this week's recommended resource, the website College Tables. The site was created by Dr. Brian O'Meara, who wanted to make sense of the college admissions process when he was working with his own kids. Not happy with the factors that some well-known magazines use to create rankings, he focused on information that may be of more interest to students and their families. College Tables provides filters to search for schools based on things like climate, library resources, walkability of a campus, the number of tenure-track faculty, or critically, for some students, a school's proximity to mountains. In addition to the expected admissions rates, it also has information on the yield of a particular school, which is the percentage of students accepted that end up attending that school. It also provides stats on the institutional health by sharing the percentage of revenue from government sources versus revenue from tuition and fees, and of course, along with undergraduate enrollment trends. One of the unique features of the site is that it doesn't shy away from even the most divisive societal issues. It reports on gun law stringency of the state, state support for contraception, same-sex marriage, and anti-trans legislative risk. The site is very transparent about the data provided and shares details on the metrics used and links to their primary sources of information. You can begin researching the schools your student is interested in at Collegetables.info.
Well, and I'll just throw in. I mean, even to steer clear of all the very highly charged political stuff, right? But just put all that aside. Even
Just period.
every one of us throughout our lives is going to have to make decisions about things like our own medical care. So you have some
Exactly.
sort of medical problem. You go to your doctor. They tell you, well, this treatment is available or this medication is available, right? You want to be able to ask, and you hope to be able to get answers to how effective is it? How long has this drug been on the market? Right? What's your experience with it? You know, what trials have been done? Is this experimental? Right? You want to know evidence that it's going to work for you, or you're going to have to make decisions about where to invest your money, and you want to know
Yes.
what's the track record of this particular investment, and what's the likelihood that I'm going to lose my money or make money, or that this is a worthwhile. Right? Every decision we make, we want to make in a way that's based on some kind of evidence. Now, there are certain kinds of decisions you might make, who I'm going to fall in love with and marry might be,
Right, yeah. Different kinds of evidence, right?
Different kinds of evidence. Maybe you rely more on your gut and less on, on something objective. But the truth is that in a lot of decisions in life, we want to base, even in the decision on where to go to college, you want to base it on some kind of evidence. So begin by thinking about what kind of evidence is going to be meaningful and relevant.
Right.
So I think these are skills that are useful really throughout our lives. And I think college is a great place to begin gaining them and honing those skills for the long term.
Right. I think that, also just kids neurodevelopmentally, they're in this space where they can start doing more abstract thinking as young adults, whereas, maybe 15, 16, 14, it's kind of an uphill battle for some kids. I think the thing that always strikes me is that, human beings, we have to process information really quickly all the time. So we use heuristics like, well, the last time I turned this corner, there was a tiger there. So I'm going to expect the tiger is going to be there the next time. And, 85% of the time that's right. But it's not based on logic. It's based on association. It's not based on evidence, right? It's not like I didn't take a study of how many tigers or how many corners, in a 1 mile radius to, make a predictive model.
Yeah.
But this kind of, if people can start doing this in a systematic way, it takes them out of that kind of thinking, and it helps them realize what their kind of biases are and to be able to weigh evidence more effectively.
Right. Absolutely. I was like, one of the things I talk about in the book is what, as you will know as a psychologist, we call confirmation bias, right? We are all inclined, our brains seem to be wired in a way that we are inclined to pay attention to and believe things that reinforce prior beliefs. So, if I come across information that challenges something I already believe, and especially if I believe it really strongly, I'm disinclined to trust it.
Right.
Right. It might well be true, but if it challenges me, I'm disinclined to trust it. And that's true of people right, left, and center. It's generally true about all human beings. And so one of the things that critical thinking in college is about is to help us confront our own biases and to help us realize that we may be exposed to points of view and evidence that will challenge things that we grew up believing or things that we were told, maybe even things that our parents told us. And it can sometimes be unsettling. College education is not always comfortable. It's sometimes quite uncomfortable in exactly that way. And that's a good thing, we think, because it's teaching us to really pay attention to evidence and implications and not just to fall into the rut of continuing to believe whatever we were told sometime early in life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think that is a great thing. And again, even in academia or science, there are these confirmation biases that highly trained, professional, educated people have. I know in my field in psychology, depending on what, sort of school of philosophy of human behavior you come from, you tend to explain everything with that explanation in mind and kind of ignore all the other explanations. And over years of just talking to people, I realized that some things are true from all of them and nothing is totally true from any of them. But, people spend their whole lives in one particular thing. So I think, again, if you're constantly being rigorous with yourself and asking these questions, then you're going to be less likely to do that. I think, too, that the application and the new implication piece, like that's the secret sauce of creativity and progress, right? I mean, so if people can just start habitually doing that, I think we're going to see a lot of things happen and improve.
Yeah, I would hope.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I had going for me going to the University of Chicago is I had an English teacher in my junior year of high school, and she would make us do these charts on pretty much every word of every piece of literature that we read, where we had to make implications for self, to other, and to the world. And so I just became very practiced at making these generalizations and implications. And I pretty much do that all day long as a therapist, quite honestly. And that is the only reason why I think I didn't fail out, because she just made us do it over and over and over and over until it was just, I would see any symbol and bam, I had 3 explanations of things it could do and different implications. And so I think that's really important.
Well, and the point is, and that example, Lisa, is really useful too, because actually those 4 things that I laid out sound pretty simple, and in a certain way they are, but it takes us a very long time to learn how to do them, to really train our minds to work that way as sort of second nature, because as you said, it's really easy for us to sort of just default to the theory that we know, or the explanation that comes most readily to mind. And so in a certain way, it takes all of college and a long time beyond college often of practicing these skills before we really, really get good at them. And so I think your example is great in the sense that the more you reinforce them and the more you're focused on them through your college education, the more you'll realize that, even though your chemistry class and your history class and your political science class and whatever, your physics class are all very different, in a certain way, the basics of training you to think about context and comparison and evidence and implications, those things are present throughout. And if you keep focusing on them and noticing the ways in which they keep coming up in different forms, in different fields, you're going to begin to sort of get that ingrained in you, and that those habits of mind will then become a part of who you are and how you think about everything.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. And I think even, your book has a lot of more advice. And I think even if people just took these 4 questions and started practicing applying them, they'd be way ahead of the pack.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Lisa!
Hey, how are you?
Good. You know how it drives you crazy when you remember something, or you're trying to say something to somebody and then you forget it, you can't remember?
That happens to me at almost every moment of the day.
So that happened last time when you and I were recording our questions. There was something that was bugging me. I couldn't remember. And it was, remember when we did the Guilford Spotlight and I was like, I think Guilford might be the most liberal school in the Southeast. And then after we got off, I thought Warren Wilson. I think Warren Wilson might be more liberal.
Yeah.
And that's what I just remembered.
Warren Wilson's a very unique place.
It really is. You know what place I don't know if you've been, and I think it's an amazing school. If you haven't, I want to really encourage you. Have you been to Queens?
In Charlotte?
Queens is awesome. It really is. Joyce seriously considered Queens too. And I just think that's a totally, totally underrated school. So I know you're getting to almost all the North Carolina schools.
I want to plan a Charlotte trip.
Yes.
So that's next on my docket.
Make sure Queens is on it.
I will do that. Thank you.
Definitely do that. So that's a good segue. So listeners, I know it sounds like Lisa and I are just having this little sidebar conversation here, but we'll bring...
Oh, wait, there are people listening? Yeah. It's not just you and me? Oh, no. Sorry, people.
But I'm in North Carolina mode because Lisa and I visited together, High Point on the 3rd of May and then Elon on the 9th of May. And then I did Furman on the 11th, which is South Carolina, but not. It's
it's
about an hour. It's about an hour and a half outside of North Carolina. Oh, did you do that? You haven't done that. That one's coming up.
I'm just saying that you can't say that South Carolina and North
I
Carolina.
know the two states are very different.
They're very different.
They're very different. But we're gonna do that one too. That one will be interesting because you're visiting like 3 weeks after me or a month after me. But so today we're gonna talk about High Point, and we're gonna be really informal. We didn't come up with some big organized plan like do this, do that, and just share our thoughts. But why don't you kick it off and share your thoughts, and I'll share my thoughts, and then we'll just kind of get into some of the things that are unique and distinctive about them.
Right. Well, with High Point, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd heard so many things about the school. Its reputation kind of precedes it as like a country club school, but also this really great school that's great for kids with learning differences and a lot of like almost irreconcilable concepts I had heard. So I was very excited to go. But when I got there, it was crazy that day. They were getting ready for graduation. So there was so much activity. There was like trucks and people and plants and chairs. And it was really organized chaos. But I felt like I was in New York, walking down the street in Manhattan. It had that kind of level activity. But you go in and you pull up and, of course, have your names lit up in lights, which was not as thrilling as I thought it was going to be.
I don't know if you know this, but I took a picture of your name in lights.
You showed me.
I did.
It's probably the only time it's ever going to be in lights, but but then, during the day, I struggled again with these kind of seemingly like, very incompatible ideas about High Point. So much so that I felt like my brain was going to explode after a few hours of this. Because on the one hand, it's like opulent, and it feels like you're on a really, I've never been on a really nice cruise ship. It feels like what I imagined being on a really nice cruise ship would be. There's music playing in the quad. Everything's beautiful. Chandelier this. Just unbelievable. And so that to me, I was just kind of, didn't know what to make of that. At the same time, there's so many unique things about this school and they offer so many unique things. And it really started to challenge my assumptions about what higher education looks like. So I guess that's where I'll let you take over and share.
So I have a question for you first. What were the things you had heard before? And then were they reinforced or were they different when you visited?
Well, I had heard about, lots of college consultants like to, kind of bash the steakhouse. So
sure.
That was the same.
You want to tell our listeners what the steakhouse is?
Yeah. So the students can eat once a week at the steakhouse, and it's like a full steak dinner. I don't eat meat, so Mark will tell you whether those.
It's Prime. So people, it's called Prime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
yeah.
But anyway, and they do it. They say because they want to teach you how not to be, a slob and learn how to eat at a nice restaurant, and also so you can practice your steak dinner interviewing skills at this restaurant. But also, probably a lot of kids just like to go as a treat, eat there once a week. Sure. You have to make a reservation. I love the fact that if you don't show up your reservation, the president of the university has decided that you will be banned from that restaurant for a month or a quarter or something. Like he does not tolerate that sort of rudeness. So that I had heard. I'd also heard it was very, very conservative. Mm-hmm. And I actually didn't feel that when I was there. I felt like it was more conservative than many schools I went, but it didn't feel... and I guess, it depends on the definition of conservative
sure.
these days keeps changing rapidly, but it definitely didn't feel more of the very extreme right wing of the party conservative. It felt more like old school Republican conservative to me. So those were two things that I kind of had walked in with.
Yeah. And Lisa knows this. I spent about a hour on campus before, but I never went through the formal process. Like Lisa and I got a full blown, maybe hour and a half golf cart tour. It was a combination of golf cart and then pop off and walk in buildings, go back on the golf cart. Then we had about almost an hour meeting with an admission officer, sit
right.
down, And then we briefly got to talk to a senior level admission staffer. That was really nice. So for me, but I've had lots of people visit as well. So I have a lot of that input in my mind from feedback beyond that. The main thing to me that I thought before, well, let me take a step back. I had originally had a fairly negative view of High Point, but this goes back to following it like in early 2000s. So High Point was just like this sleepy furniture town that's kind of dying and atrophying and losing people and losing population. And the school was really struggling financially. And so I knew that when I always forget how to say the president's name.
Nico Orban?
Yeah. So the president, we got to meet him, which was interesting.
Yeah, he was so charming.
Yes.
He just oozed charm.
He did. And our tour guide said that he would have probably spent half an hour with us, but he was actually looked like a VIP tour that he was doing. And so before he came, I knew the school to be very different. On the negative side, it was really struggling. But on the positive side, it was probably reflected the diversity of North Carolina. And then they went in this direction of, the classic thing that you hear, build it and they will come.
Right.
And so I knew they went on this couple $1 billion building extravaganza and really did not really prioritize access and really kind of ran it as a business. And so some of those things I thought were overboard, and I wondered to what degree is our educational values driving the school versus just being completely like corporate America. And then I wondered with the facilities, okay, they're so extravagant. Is this just almost like bribery with with all of these niceties? But what I came away after this trip really impressed. And what I failed to realize before, they bill themselves as the premier life skills university. You'll see that all over when you're driving North Carolina, the billboards everywhere.
Yes, they do.
And what I found was that they backed it up in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I'd heard this before, but I'd heard that they consistently do things that the job market wants that they feel other universities are not providing. But I was quite impressed at the level and the extent to which they did it. And what I saw was that commitment to excellence in the facilities extends to the commitment in excellence to delivering an education that will prepare people to be successful in the job market. And I'll get into lots and lots and lots of different examples because I'm sure some people are like, well, what are you talking about? What does that practically look like? But I've never seen Lisa so gobsmacked.
It takes a lot to gobsmack me.
Really does.
I've heard some things I'm not usually ruffled, but for whatever reason, that school just short-circuited my brain.
After the end, Lisa was like, my head is spinning. I don't know what to think. And then a day later, she was still in the same state.
Yeah.
She needed to process because the facilities really are they're like, I've never seen anything that extravagant at any school I've ever been to. Not that extravagant. And there's a commitment to excellence there that you can't deny. Everything's pristine. It's top notch. It's first class. There's times I did struggle with, is all of this educational mission? Let's take the steakhouse.
Well, yeah. It's a stretch, right? Yes, you can get benefits from having weekly dinners at steakhouses. You can also probably go off campus and, have weekly dinners at steak. I don't know. You don't have to, they had that, replica of an airplane.
Yes.
At one place where then you can sit with professors and they talk to you like you're supposed to have an airplane conversation. You don't actually have to sit in a replica of an airplane to practice it. You can probably put two chairs. So some of that seemed like a little theatrical.
Correct.
To me.
I agree 100%. So, because the way they explain is the reason why we replicate the airplane here is because you're going to be sitting at an airplane and you need to know how to transact business in an airplane, and we talk about the steakhouse singular, but we should really expand.
Oh yeah, there's like also the Italian restaurant.
Well, it's a Lou, another 5-star that's up now. That's unbelievable. It's been up for a year and a half, and they're building a brand new state-of-the-art dorm complex that's going to have a hibachi 5-star in it. So third one.
And also a nail salon and a hair salon, which I was excited about.
So I have mixed feelings on this stuff. Like, there's a part of me that just, this might offend some people, but there's a part of me that feels like, you know what? It's so competitive out there that if you're able to do something that draws people and it pays for itself, there's a part of that I respect. Because I don't respect it if you're compromising all the other things you should be doing as far as investing in things like financial aid and in strong programming and all that stuff. But because I saw a lot of that strong programming there, so there's a part of me that respects strategic things that are done that draw people in. And I know it's marketing, but successful marketing, if it's not unethical, there's a part of me that respects that. And I just know how competitive it is out there in this world. But the part that was a little uncomfortable for me was the reason why they would say they would do it. Like, just admit, like, guess what? There's kids who'd rather have an $85 meal at a steakhouse than be at the dorm. And there's some of them that will pick us because we offer these kinds of amenities.
Right. And
so we're in the business of attracting students. And so that's what we're going to do. Like, that's just the reality. And so there were a few things like that. One thing, personally, I think this was a little irksome for both of us. Maybe, they play this classical music constantly all the time.
I need it to be quiet. That might have been part of why I was addled. So just let me think.
Yeah. Well, they say the proven research shows that playing classical music helps your retention, but it sort of at times feels like a little pseudo sophistication. But listen, I don't want to emphasize those things too much because, I was so impressed with the things that they have that give people skills that just work in the marketing world, that just work in the real world.
Right.
And they just think differently than other schools when it comes to that kind of thing. So here's just one simple example that I'll give, and we'll mention a lot of them because there's a lot of different things to mention. But they give a lot of merit scholarship money. And this, Lisa and I were sitting down meeting with an admission rep, and I looked at the chart, and it said their presidential scholarship that they offer is between $9,000 to $20,000. They have a bunch of different ones. So I wanted to know, well, 9 to 20, that's a pretty big range. Like, what's the difference between the person that gets 9 and the person that gets 20? And so this is how they do it. Well, immediately they look at your GPA. And they recalculate your GPA, but they use a cumulative GPA. And so typically students that are about a 3.6 or higher are going to start out getting about 9,000 right away, just off a GPA. And then they look at a few other things, like they look at the rigor of your curriculum. You can get bonus points for rigor. And they do look at test scores if you submit and you have some high scores. This is an example of how sometimes we're sharing that even if schools are test optional, they can sometimes help you with scholarship. You can get a little bit of scholarship money for test scores and increased rigor. They mostly are using GPA to make their decisions, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But then here's the thing that really impressed me. So they do massive interview days. You talk about scholarship day, scholarship weekend, scholarship day. They have 2 of them. And this is crazy. One of them brings in 1,250 people to campus, counting adults. Another one brings in 1,000 people to adults, counting parents. 650 students go through interviews. They interview with 2 professors and 2 past scholarship winners. They get their own business cards with their own little wallets, and you're interviewing with somebody in your area of your major. And you can get up to $12,000 more by crushing the interview.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why they simulate it that way, because in the real world, a lot of times, a lot of resumes come in, good GPAs, this, that, the other, but you have to crush the interview to get the job. So they set their
Right.
structure up that way. And I actually like that. And they have just a lot of things like that in their system. You know, they have their Belk entrepreneurship scholarships where it's like simulated Shark Tank scenarios, and then you can win up to $10,000. They just have a lot of things. What did you think about that on the scholarship thing?
I mean, I think it's good. Obviously, you're going to self-select for people who are already good at interviewing to get them there, you know. So, you know, if your mission is to teach the unskilled life skills, then you probably failed with that already, because you've already got people with some skills maybe coming to this school.
Well, I don't think they do that. I think they're just looking off GPA and they invite you.
Right. But what I'm saying is, like,
you need to get the big award. You need the people to get the largest awards.
The money
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that being said, I think it's an honest way to do that, because they want those kids. It's a different kind of school than, you know, you'll find most other places. And it's good that you go on campus and you look at it. The one thing that he also said, that like demonstrated interest is everything. It's everything. They want you to email them. They expect to hear from you. They want, you know, you to come visit. If you can't come visit, they want you to talk to, like, do an interview with them. I mean, that is, you might think, one of the most important criteria for admission and scholarship there.
Well, I'm going to push back a little on that. I mean, they did say if you apply late, like February and March, and you ghost us, we're ghosting you back. Right. So they did say that, but there are some schools, Tulane comes to mind, okay? Tulane expects, especially under the old leadership team. I don't know about the new leadership team now that, what's his name from Temple's over there. But they used to expect such a high level of engagement to be considered showing demonstrated interest.
Yeah.
Where I don't see High Point doing that.
No,
if you visit the school and you apply early, then you're fine.
You're good.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, like, you know, like they want you to, they look at that though, you know.
Yeah, them and like zillions of others, because you know it's so competitive out there, and their schools are trying to identify the people interested in them. But there's one thing we should talk about, and this is why I think this school, like, I really think 10, 15, 20 years from now, High Point is going to be like one of those wow schools. Because I'm looking at its trajectory. And like, do you know, Lisa, that before the new president took over, they had 1,450 students?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was like, he's done a remarkable job, you know, turning that school around.
I mean, just for our listeners, so they had 1,450 students in 2005. Now they have 1,500 in a class. So that's more than quadruple. And then in addition to that, I mean, they're rolling out a law school. They're rolling out an optometry school, a dental school. They've just started a PA school with these biomechanics labs. They've recently introduced nursing and engineering. It's just a completely different school. And then they're building, what was it, like an 800-person new dorm with all, you know.
Right.
So
they can add more kids.
Yeah. And some people may not like this. They had a 10% price increase last year, which taking them from like 58,000 to 65,000, like cost of attendance all in before scholarships. I mean, most students probably pay 40, you know, all in after scholarships, but depends, you know, how strong you are. But that partly to me is an attestation to how far they've come, because there's a lot of schools out here that wouldn't even dare raise their prices at all because they don't think the market could sustain it. The fact that you can do that after you've quadrupled your school in 18 years. But just a lot of things they have. Like, so for example, if somebody's, I can't remember if they use the language undeclared or undecided, but whichever one it is, they have great advising. Like, they have mandatory monthly advising.
Mm-hmm. Every 2 weeks, I think, if you're undecided, right?
It might be. And they take you through, like, I mean, there's just a lot of things that they do that, like, I see them as leaders, not followers. And another thing is they have their research assistants. So if you want to if you're interested in research, you start out as this research assistants for all majors. They take you through these 15 different tasks. Then you do a project. Then they partner you with a professor. Then you start doing actual research with professor. Your name goes on the research. Then you start traveling to conferences. And a lot of times they said that they're one of the very few places that have like undergraduate students traveling to these conferences with their professors presenting the research, and the students' names like go on the research.
Right, right.
They have these, what do they call them? 50 faculty in residence. Like, these are really famous people. Like, you're looking at
like the rich, famous cognoscenti are coming to campus and giving talks and meeting with kids.
Yeah, there's 50 of them. And like, at first I thought these were, okay, this is like pure marketing. They have these names. These are the people that came like once every 10 years.
No, but they come.
I know, they come and they hang out and they interact.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, Lisa, you had to leave early than me because you have kids and you have pickup. But, I stayed behind and I interacted with a lot of students. And the students have a lot of pride in the school. Like, they were like, this place is amazing. They were very friendly. They were very helpful. They had really high self-esteem about their school. I want to go back to what you said about the politics. I would agree with you. Like, I had heard from a few people or so that it's MAGA. It's not MAGA. It is conservative, and it leans Republican, but it's like purple to pink, not like MAGA red.
Right.
One of the students I talked to, he was like, one thing I like about the school is a lot of people that believe in God here, and a lot of places they don't believe in God. And if you want to find a cohort of people that believe in God, you can find it here. I think it feels more like just pure, it feels like they're just pure capitalists more than they're not MAGA.
Well, there's not like that social agenda that we're seeing a lot of now. They're trying to control discourse. Like, I didn't feel like there would be hostility against LGBTQ students. I know they're trying to recruit more minority students. I mean, it's just like they are all about making some money.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with making some money.
That came out of Lisa's mouth?
I'm just saying, there is a way to make money and not screw a bunch of people over in the process.
Yeah.
And I have no problem with that. And I mean, I feel like that's kind of what this school is doing.
Yeah. And I think another reason I appreciate it is because, I mean, you know this, Lisa, we work with all types of people, and it can be hard for conservatives to find schools if they're looking for something that's center right.
Right.
There's so many places that are center left because most students lean more liberal and progressive. So like when you have a school that's center right like that just comes in handy to have schools like that, because you do get requests from families. And so that's probably another thing that I appreciated about it, because there's a lot of students I work with. I mean, most are not center right, but I work with a sizable number that are, and they want this. They want an environment where maybe they won't be foot down for their faith, or they won't feel like there's complete intolerance for their perspectives. And I'm not talking about MAGA. I'm just talking about like people that are just more conservative in their ideology that are not MAGA.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I liked about the school, like there was a lot of student support. And there were students everywhere, and it was finals week, and those kids were studying. They were not blowing it off. There's a lot of student support. There's a lot of ways for students to practice real life skills. They have these rooms, like they make you do a lot of presentations. They have these rooms you can go into and record your presentation and practice, play it back, maybe get some critique on it from somebody like a professor. And then, that's all before you ever go to class and make your presentation. The advising is unbelievable. You just don't see that level of advising at most schools. And they do have a great program for kids who have attention deficit disorder. It is an add-on price, but they have executive functioning coaches, professional tutoring, the whole enchilada there.
Yeah, they were even talking about meeting as much as 3 times a week with the kids in that program. Add-on.
What you need sometimes. So like what I'm saying is like they have great advising. I think they really try to like, your kid's not going to get lost there. And if you have a kid who maybe just needs a little more support in certain areas, I think they're not going to, be forgotten. They're going to really help them get through. So, I mean, I think that is great. And I do think there is something, because what I feel like is what they're trying to do with the steakhouse and the airplane and all of the different things, that are kind of surrounding that is they're trying to acculturate people into like basically white capitalist upper middle class society. Like, this is how you act, this is what you say, this is what you're expected to do, and personally I feel like if you took some kids who were never exposed to that and put them at High Point and taught them that would probably, that's kind of why sometimes it's like a hidden advantage that people who already have parents who know all that stuff have, right? They are explicitly giving that. So I feel like that is another real strength of the school.
Yeah. And just to follow up with what Lisa said on that. So one thing that they were absolutely unapologetic about is everybody gets an internship here. Like everybody, like I guess the rate is technically 99%, but I love the system. Like they don't just tell them about Handshake. They show them how to use Handshake. They don't just tell them about LinkedIn. They show them how to use LinkedIn, and they take them through this 23-step process to how to market yourself and get internships. And then if you can't get one, they get one for you. And they're really serious about that. And so, yeah, so it just kind of goes along with, what Lisa's saying, like they are preparing you to transition into world. Friends, this concludes the first part of our spotlight on High Point University. We hope you'll return next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'm going to have something in our preamble section, and I'm still debating what that will be. So rather than mention it and then have to call an audible and correct it, I'm going to hold off on that. But we will have that, and then we will also have the final part of Lisa's interview with Elliot Felix. And Elliot Felix is teaching us not only about going to college, but how to go to college successfully. And so there'll be part 2 of Lisa interviewing Elliot Felix about his excellent book. And friends, I want to close you out with something that is at the bottom of every single one of the emails that I send to everybody. It's, almost a little adage that I live by, and it simply says this: your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. Did you catch that? Your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. In other words, friends, and I'm speaking now not just to students, but to parents, be the most positive person in the room. Be the most positive person in your school, in your grade, in your class. Parents, be the most positive person in the office that you work in. See you Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.